My phone rang at 10:42 that night. I remember the time because I looked right at the clock when I picked it up. I'd just gotten my tie off and was rubbing my shoulder, sore from standing around all evening, when I saw the name on the screen. My daughter. She never calls that late. Not once in years. "Dad?" Her voice wasn't right. "What happened?" I said. My first thought was that something had happened to one of the kids. Long pause. Too long for comfort. "They stopped the ceremony," she said. "They just stopped it. The commanding general walked in and everything froze. He wouldn't let them start again until they found you." I sat down slow on the edge of the bed. Stopped the whole ceremony. For me. That didn't line up with anything. I knew about that room, or my place in it. "Dad, are you there?" "I'm here," I said, rubbing my eyes with the back of my hand. "Why would they stop it for me?" "I don't know. Nobody would tell us anything." She took a breath, and I heard something else in it now, something wet. "And then he saluted you, in front of everybody. Dad, why did he salute you?" I closed my eyes. My jacket still hung over the dining room chair where I'd thrown it an hour before, and already that ballroom felt like something that had happened a long time ago, not a couple hours. "Dad, why didn't you ever tell us?" I knew exactly what she meant. A couple hours earlier, my own son-in-law had introduced me to a room full of people as nothing more than my wife's retired father. I told her I'd explain everything. But something strange had happened that night, well before the general ever walked through those doors, and to make sense of it, I'm going to have to back up further than tonight. I retired 15 years ago, hung up the uniform, picked up a fishing rod, and never talked about my career again. Even my grandkids thought Grandpa had worked somewhere in the Army. That's exactly how I wanted it. That decision was still sitting there, unexamined, the night everything changed, but none of that would matter until dessert. Before I tell you what happened that night, you need to know Ethan. My daughter married him a few years after I retired. Sharp kid, good degree, nice suits, phone buzzing even at Thanksgiving. He respected the military, certain parts of it anyway, the kind that gets quoted on the news. He'd decided early on I'd probably retire to colonel, maybe run logistics. Nothing worth asking about. He never yelled at me. It was smaller than that. "You probably wouldn't enjoy this conversation, Dad. We're discussing something serious here." Small comments. The kind that stick. My daughter noticed every time. She'd apologize on his behalf, drying dishes nobody had asked her to dry. "Leave it alone," I told her once. "It's got to come find him on its own." I believed that. Some years it got harder, too. I nearly turned down the banquet invitation. If I had, I don't think any of what happened next ever gets discovered. Big affair. Ethan's company, new government contract, Army leadership, cameras in the lobby. I said yes for my daughter's sake and wore a plain Navy suit. No medals, no pins, nothing that would tell a stranger I'd ever worn a uniform. Walked in and felt out of place right away. Ethan introduced me to a few people. "This is my wife's father." Nothing more. Then set me at a table near the kitchen doors and left me there. I figured that suited me fine. A retired colonel near the bar looked at me once, looked away, then he half stood up out of his chair, sat back down again like he'd caught himself doing something foolish. I should have walked over and introduced myself. I almost did. I'm glad I didn't. A young officer checked my name against a clipboard, frowned, and walked off without a word. I figured I'd been seated in the wrong section. I was wrong about that. I just didn't know it yet. Near the end of dinner, another officer by the door pressed a hand to his ear like he was listening to something, and went pale. He started talking fast into a radio, looking right at me while he did it, then vanished through a side door. It didn't make sense to me then. It wouldn't make sense for almost another hour. There was one chair at the head table, empty the whole meal, and nobody could say who it was for. I ate my dinner roll and figured the night would wrap up soon. Looking back now, that empty chair should have told me everything. I just didn't know it yet. The doors opened partway through the CEO's speech, and the commanding general of the United States Army walked in. He scanned the room fast and started toward the head table, toward that empty chair. Then he stopped, turned back around, searched the room again, confusion plain on his face. His aide leaned over and said something. That's when his eyes landed on the back of the ballroom and stayed there. For a second he didn't move. Then he changed course completely, walking past the head table, past senators, past men who'd paid good money to stand near him, straight toward me. The room noticed before I did. Talking died out table by table like a wave rolling backward. I remember thinking someone important must be sitting right behind me, and I actually turned to check. Nobody was there. The whole ballroom went dead quiet, and he came to attention and saluted me, full and sharp. "Sir," he said, carrying clean across the room, "it is the greatest honor of my career to see you again." I stood and returned it before I'd even decided to. My hands were shaking a little by the time I brought them back down. Then he leaned in close, quiet now, just for me. "Sir," he said, "I still carry your letter." I had no idea what letter he meant. I wouldn't understand until the parking lot. That's when things started moving faster than I could follow. The CEO froze at the podium, microphone hanging in his hand. Across the table, Ethan let out a short laugh, the kind that doesn't mean anything's funny. He looked at my daughter, looked around the room. Nobody looked back at him. A man near him leaned over. "You never told us your father-in-law was him." Ethan looked toward me, started to stand, sat back down. I don't think he'd ever felt smaller in his life. My daughter looked from the general to me to Ethan, back to me again, like she was working something out in real time, like 30 years of living beside a man had just cracked open and she was seeing what had been underneath it the whole time. The general reached into the inside pocket of his dress coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper, worn almost white along the creases. He didn't hand it to me, just held it up like proof of something. "You wrote this to me when I was a lieutenant," he said. "I'd nearly turned in my resignation. You told me one bad week wasn't allowed to define 30 years. He folded it back up. I've carried it ever since." A young officer lifted the reserved sign off the head table and set it down in front of me instead. The retired colonel from the bar stood up, hand over his mouth. "It's him," he said, loud enough that half the room turned. "It's really him?" Somebody near the back mentioned West Point, said they still teach one of my old decisions there, and the word moved table to table faster than I could have stopped it. Then people started standing. Officers first, then the veterans among the contractors, then the whole room, rising the way dominoes fall in reverse. "Dad," my daughter mouthed, across all that noise. That was all. The rest of the evening blurred together. Men I didn't know remembered moments I'd forgotten. I only remember one of them clearly. A contractor who told me his father had made it home because of orders I'd once given, orders that had cost me plenty of sleep and that I'd never told a soul about. I let that be the one story I really sat with, because it was enough. I've never seen the sense in needing 6 versions of the same thing said about you. We ended up outside afterward, in the parking lot, under one of those lights that buzzes. I spent 4 years trying to impress people who already respected you, Ethan said, then quieter. I don't know whether to apologize or thank you. That one landed harder than anything he'd said all night. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" he asked. Next. I didn't answer right away. We stood there a while, the cold finally reaching me after that hot ballroom, and I thought about that letter and what it means to carry something folded in your coat for 30 years because a man once told, "You a bad week doesn't get to define you." "Because I wanted you to know me," I finally said. "Not my rank, and if I'm honest, Some part of me was scared of what happened if I told you, and it still wasn't enough. He didn't say anything for a bit. Then, I don't know how you fix 4 years. In a parking lot. You don't, I told him. Not tonight. You just stop doing it tomorrow and let it add up slow, the same way the other thing did. Dad, my daughter said again, and just like that I was back on the phone, back in my quiet bedroom. I'm here, I said. I keep thinking about all those years, she said. Why'd you let us think you were just nobody? You never thought that. Ethan didn't either, not really. He just never had a reason to look closer, and I never gave him one. He hasn't moved from the kitchen table. Let him sit there a while. If it's real, it'll come slow. And if it doesn't come at all, then I'm still exactly who I was this morning. An old man with a dented truck and a fence to fix for Ed on Saturday. It took the better part of a year before things with Ethan stopped feeling like a performance and started feeling like just how we are now. He calls more these days, and he listens when he does. My grandson found my old shadow box in the closet a while back, digging for a baseball glove I'd promised him. 4 silver stars, ribbons gone soft with age. More letters than I could count, from soldiers whose names he'd never heard. Grandpa, he said, eyes wide. Were you really famous? I took the box from him, closed the lid, and sat there a second with my hand still resting on top of it. No, I said. I was responsible. Those aren't the same thing. I wasn't proudest of the stars on my shoulder. I was proudest that when they finally came off, I still knew who I was. If you've ever been underestimated, or if you've ever realized, too, late who someone really was, I'd like to hear that story.